You know this photograph. Everyone knows this photograph. The wild hair, the mustache, the tongue stuck out at a photographer who had simply asked him to smile one more time. It has been printed on T-shirts, coffee mugs, dormitory posters. It is, perhaps, the most reproduced image of a scientist in human history, and it tells you exactly what you think you already know about Albert Einstein, that he was funny, eccentric, harmless, a lovable old genius who solved the universe, and then made a silly face about it. Now look at this one. August 6, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. A single bomb falls over the city of Hiroshima, Japan. In the time it takes you to read this sentence, 70,000 human beings are gone. Not wounded, not displaced, gone, vaporized, incinerated, erased from the record of the living in a single blinding instant. 2 images, 1 man. Between the tongue and the mushroom cloud lies 5 characters. E equals mc squared. 5 symbols that describe, with perfect mathematical elegance, the secret architecture of the stars, and that, when translated into steel and uranium, became the blueprint for the deadliest weapon ever built. How does that happen? How does a man who spent his entire life chasing pure, abstract truth, a man who called himself a pacifist, who refused to own a gun, who once said that if he had known what his work would lead to, he would have become a watchmaker instead, become, in the eyes of history, the father of the atomic age? There is no simple answer. The answer does not live in a single equation, or a single decision, or a single year. It lives in the whole shape of a life, 80 years long, full of brilliance and failure, tenderness and cruelty, glory and unbearable guilt. And it does not begin in a laboratory. It begins in a small apartment in southern Germany, in the arms of a mother who was certain something was wrong with her son, because Albert Einstein could not speak. On Friday afternoon, March 14, 1879, in the medieval city of Ulm, in the kingdom of Württemberg, a son was born to Hermann and Pauline Einstein. They named him Albert. There was nothing in that moment, no comet, no omen, no sign whatsoever, to suggest that this child would one day rewrite the laws governing space and time. He was, by every visible measure, an unremarkable infant, born into an unremarkable family, in an unremarkable corner of the German Empire. His father, Hermann Einstein, was a warm, jovial man, the kind of man who told jokes at dinner and rarely held a grudge. He was also, by most practical measures, a failure in business. Hermann had a talent for mathematics that he never got to use professionally. Instead, he traded in feather beds before turning, with his brother Jakob, to a far riskier venture, electrical engineering, in an age when electricity itself was still a frontier technology, half magic and half science. Jakob was the technical mind of the 2 brothers, the engineer, the one who actually understood how the machines worked. Hermann was the salesman, the optimist, the one who believed the next contract would finally make them rich. It would never quite work out. The Einstein brothers' company would eventually fail not once but twice, a shadow of financial instability that would follow Albert through his entire childhood. His mother, Pauline Koch, was a different kind of force entirely. Cultured, musically trained, sharp-tongued when she needed to be, Pauline was the disciplinarian and the dreamer of the household. She loved music with a passion that bordered on religious devotion, and she insisted, over young Albert's loud and persistent objections, that he learn the violin. He hated it, at first. The lessons felt like punishment. Like every other piece of forced instruction, the world seemed intent on imposing on him. But his mother did not relent, and that single act of maternal stubbornness would, decades later, give the most famous scientist in the world his only true escape from the prison of his own thoughts. A violin held against his shoulder while equations refused to resolve themselves in his mind. The Einsteins were Jewish, but not in any way that would have marked them as devout. They were secular Jews, assimilated into German culture, observing no Sabbath, following no dietary law, attending no synagogue with any regularity. They considered themselves German first, intellectual second, and Jewish almost incidentally, a fact, not a faith. This tension between a Jewish identity inherited but not practiced, and a German identity embraced but never fully reciprocated, would define Albert Einstein for the rest of his life. He would spend decades believing himself fully German, only to be told, by the country he loved, that he was not German at all. He was simply a Jew. That betrayal had not yet arrived. but its roots were already planted, here, in this comfortable, secular, assimilated household in Ulm. And then there was the silence. Albert did not speak, not at the age when other children began forming words, not for a long while after that. His grandmother, looking at this quiet, watchful boy, reportedly called him almost stupid, dummkopf, slow-witted. His parents grew genuinely afraid. They took him to doctors, searching for some explanation, some diagnosis, some reassurance that nothing was fundamentally wrong with their son's mind. The doctors found nothing. And nothing, in this case, did not mean nothing was happening. It meant they were looking in the wrong place entirely. Here is what was actually happening inside that silent boy's mind. And it is not a quirky childhood anecdote. It is the first visible evidence of how Albert Einstein's mind would work for the rest of his life. He was not slow, he was careful. By his own later accounts and the recollections of those who knew him, young Albert developed an unusual habit. Before speaking a sentence aloud, he would first whisper it to himself, quietly, under his breath, testing it, checking it, making sure the words matched what he actually meant before he committed to saying them out loud. He continued this strange private rehearsal until he was around 7 years old. Think about what that means. Most children speak first and refine later, blurting, correcting, blurting again. Albert refined first. He was running a kind of internal verification process on his own thoughts before releasing them into the world. A demand for precision, for correctness, for the words to actually map onto the truth they were meant to describe, that most adults never develop at all. This same demand, that language, that explanation, must precisely match reality, with no slack, no approximation, no comfortable fiction, would later drive him to question Newton's absolute time, a concept every physicist on Earth had simply accepted for 200 years, simply because the language used to describe it did not, when examined carefully enough, actually match what could be observed. The silence was not a deficit. It was the earliest sign of a mind that refused to accept anything, including its own thoughts, without first checking whether it was true. In 1880, when Albert was barely a year old, the family relocated from Ulm to Munich. Hermann and Jakob were betting everything on the future of electrification, a new company, new ambitions, a new city. It was a gamble on the idea that the world was about to be transformed by forces too small to see, electricity, current, voltage, invisible powers that could light a city or turn a motor, if only you understood the hidden rules governing them. It is a strange and beautiful coincidence that the family's livelihood was now built on harnessing an invisible force, because very soon an entirely different invisible force would capture young Albert's imagination completely and never let go. In November 1881, Albert gained a sister, Maria, whom the family called Maja. Albert, only 2 years old himself, had apparently been told he was getting a new toy to play with. When he finally saw his baby sister for the first time, he reportedly asked, with complete sincerity, "Where are her wheels?" It is a charming story. Families have told versions of it for generations. But look past the charm for a moment, because there is something genuinely revealing underneath it. This was not simply a funny mix-up. It was a boy taking language with absolute literal seriousness, expecting the world to conform exactly to the words used to describe it. He had been told, plaything. He expected a plaything, mechanically defined, wheels and all. When reality failed to match the description, his instinct was not to laugh it off. It was to ask why. Where are the wheels that were promised? That same instinct, to demand that reality match its description exactly, and to ask hard, uncomfortable questions when it didn't, is, in miniature, the entire intellectual project that would occupy Albert Einstein for the rest of his life. The household in Munich settled into a rhythm of contrasts. Jakob, the uncle, brought patience and a gift for explaining machinery in ways a child could understand. Pauline brought culture, discipline, music. Hermann brought warmth, optimism, and a business that never quite stabilized. It was, by most accounts, a happy home, not wealthy, not always secure, but full of intellectual conversation and unconditional affection. Something was forming in the quiet of that boy's mind, something the adults around him could sense, but not name. A particular way of looking at the world, skeptical of surface appearances, hungry for the hidden machinery underneath, utterly unwilling to accept, because that's just how it is, as an answer to anything. It is sometime in 1884, in a bedroom in Munich. A 5-year-old boy lies in bed, mildly ill, nothing serious, just enough to keep him home, restless, bored. His father, Hermann, enters and sits at the edge of the bed. From his pocket he produces a small brass object, a pocket compass, and places it gently in his son's small hand. The boy looks down. The needle trembles, then settles. It points, stubbornly, in one direction. Hermann turns the compass in his hand. The needle swings, and then settles again, pointing the exact same way. He turns it again. Same result. Always the same direction. Always north. This is the moment. If Albert Einstein's life has an origin point, a single instant from which everything else flows, biographers, historians, and Einstein himself all point to this one. He was transfixed. He turned the compass in every direction he could manage, watching the needle resist him every single time, swinging back, again and again, to point the same way. There was no string pulling it, no visible mechanism forcing it. Nothing touched it at all, and yet something was clearly, undeniably acting upon it. Some force, completely invisible, completely silent, reaching across empty space and commanding a piece of metal to obey. Decades later, as an old man, one of the most celebrated scientists who had ever lived, Einstein still remembered this moment with startling clarity. He wrote, "I can still remember that this experience made a deep and lasting impression on me. Something deeply hidden had to be behind things." Sit with that phrase for a moment. Something deeply hidden had to be behind things. That is not a child's offhand comment. That is, almost word for word, the entire philosophy that would drive Einstein's scientific career for the next 7 decades. Beneath every ordinary appearance, beneath falling apples, beneath beams of light, beneath the ticking of clocks, there is hidden machinery, real, physical, discoverable machinery. And if you ask the right questions and refuse to settle for comfortable, incomplete answers, you can find it. The compass did not give young Albert knowledge. He didn't understand magnetism. Not yet, not really. What the compass gave him was something far more valuable, an obsession, a conviction, planted at 5 years old, that reality is full of invisible forces operating according to rules, and that those rules can be uncovered through patient, careful, relentless questioning. His father offered an explanation, as fathers do. The earth itself, Hermann told him, is a giant magnet. That is why the needle points north. It is responding to the planet's own magnetic field. It was a perfectly good answer for a 5-year-old. It did not satisfy Albert at all. Why should the earth be a magnet? What creates these invisible lines of force stretching out from the planet, reaching into a bedroom, into a child's hand, into a small piece of metal? What is a magnetic field, actually? Not as a name, but as a physical reality. Every answer his father gave only produced a deeper question behind it. This refusal to accept an explanation simply because it was offered by an authority figure, the demand to keep asking, "But why?" past the point where most people stop, is the single most consistent trait across Einstein's entire intellectual life. It would make him a brilliant physicist. It would also, as we will see, make him an almost impossible student. Not long after the compass, another gift arrived. This one, not an object, but an idea. Albert's uncle Jacob, the technically gifted half of the family business, introduced his young nephew to algebra, and he did it with a metaphor that captured Albert's imagination completely. The unknown quantity in an equation, Jacob explained, the mysterious x you are trying to solve for, is like a little animal. And solving the equation is the hunt, tracking the animal down, cornering it until finally you know exactly what it is. Albert loved this. Mathematics was not dry recitation. It was pursuit. It was detective work. It was the same compass needle mystery, translated into numbers, something hidden, waiting to be found, if only you asked your questions in the right order. By the time he was 12 years old, Albert had gone further than any algebra lesson could take him. He acquired a textbook on Euclidean geometry and taught himself, entirely on his own initiative, far beyond anything his school required. He later described the feeling of working through Euclid's proofs as a kind of wonder almost identical to what he'd felt holding that compass years before. Here again was hidden logical machinery, except this time the truths weren't just real, they were necessary. A geometric proof wasn't true because a teacher said so. It was true because, once you understood it, it could not possibly be otherwise. Imagine being 12 years old and discovering that some truths in this universe are not opinions, not conventions, not things adults simply decided, but inevitable, unbreakable, eternal, in a way nothing else in a child's life ever is. For Albert, that discovery was electric. Around this same period, the family, recognizing that their son's intellectual appetite had outpaced what they could provide, brought in a tutor, a young medical student named Max Talmud, who would visit regularly for both academic guidance and intellectual companionship. Talmud began by teaching mathematics and the sciences. Within a remarkably short time, the relationship inverted entirely. The student was outpacing the tutor. By age 14, Albert was reading Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, one of the most notoriously dense works in the history of Western philosophy, and appeared to genuinely grasp it. Talmud, by his own later account, found himself bewildered by the boy he was supposedly instructing. But Albert's childhood was not all wonder and discovery. There was a quieter, harder undercurrent running beneath it. He attended a Catholic elementary school, the only Jewish child in his class. The anti-Semitism he encountered there was not the organized industrial horror that would eventually engulf Europe. It was smaller, subtler, the casual exclusion of a child who is tolerated but never quite welcomed. He was different, and the other children, and sometimes the institution itself, made sure he knew it. It is easy to treat this as a minor footnote in a childhood otherwise full of wonder. It would be a mistake to do so. This was the first thread in a wound that would never fully close. The recognition, even as a small child, that his identity made him an outsider in the only country he knew as home. He would feel that wound much more sharply, much more dangerously, 50 years later. But it began here, in a Munich classroom, among children who were not unkind, so much as simply unwilling to fully include him. The compass had awakened something extraordinary in this boy, a hunger for hidden truths, a refusal to accept easy answers, a mind already operating on a different frequency than the world around him. But the German educational system that Albert was about to enter in earnest had no interest in hidden truths or hard questions. It had been built for an entirely different purpose: obedience. And it was about to come into direct, brutal conflict with exactly the kind of mind young Albert had. In 1888, Albert entered the Luitpold Gymnasium in Munich, a prestigious secondary school, and one that represented, almost perfectly, everything the newly unified German Empire believed an education should be: discipline, obedience, memorization, the systematic, top-down transfer of established knowledge from an unquestionable authority to a silent, receiving student. There was no room, in this system, for why. There was no room for a student who whispered his sentences before speaking them, who had taught himself Euclidean geometry for the sheer wonder of it, who had spent hours interrogating a compass needle. The gymnasium was not designed to produce thinkers. It was designed, quite deliberately, to produce soldiers and bureaucrats, citizens who would receive an order and execute it without hesitation or inquiry. Imagine for a moment what this meant for a mind built the way Albert's was. Every day, a boy whose deepest instinct was to question authority was placed inside an institution whose entire purpose was to suppress exactly that instinct. It was, in the most literal sense, a kind of daily torture, not physical, but intellectual and spiritual. Recitation instead of inquiry, memorization instead of understanding, submission instead of curiosity. The teachers did not respond kindly to a student who pushed back. One instructor reportedly told him directly, with no particular cruelty intended, simply as a statement of fact, as the man understood it, "You will never amount to anything, Einstein." Let that statement sit in the room for a moment. Said to the boy who would, within 2 decades, rewrite humanity's understanding of space, time, and the universe itself. Years later, after Einstein's name had become known across the world, that same teacher would insist, publicly, and apparently without irony, that he had always recognized the boy's exceptional gifts. Einstein never publicly corrected the lie, but he never forgot it either. His grades at the gymnasium were unremarkable, not because he lacked intelligence, that much should be obvious by now, but because he flatly refused to play the game the institution demanded. Memorize this, recite that, accept it, because it has been handed down. Albert's mind simply did not function that way. and no amount of institutional pressure was going to retrain it. Mathematics was the single exception, and the reason why is instructive. Mathematics could not be faked, and more importantly, it could not be controlled by an instructor's personal authority. A geometric proof either held together under logical scrutiny, or it didn't. No teacher, however much they may have disliked young Albert personally, could simply declare a correct proof wrong by force of position. Mathematics had its own internal court of appeal, and that court answered to logic, not to rank. Slowly, over years, a deeper and more troubling realization began forming in Albert's mind. Not just that this particular school was unpleasant, but that the entire institution was not actually educating its students at all. It was training them to submit to authority without resistance, to absorb instruction without question, to become exactly the kind of obedient citizen a militarizing empire required. Einstein found this not merely tedious, but morally repugnant. And this is a crucial point, one that is easy to skip past. This was not simply a teenager's rebellious distaste for school. It was the formation of a genuine, lifelong moral conviction that blind obedience to authority, any authority, was itself a kind of corruption of the human mind. He would carry that conviction through the rest of his life, through his scientific work, through his politics, through his refusal, again and again, to simply go along with what powerful institutions told him to believe. Meanwhile, the family's financial situation, never stable, was deteriorating again. Hermann and Jakob's electrical engineering company was losing ground to larger, better capitalized firms in Munich. By 1894, the family made a difficult decision. They would relocate the business to Italy, first to Milan, and then to the smaller city of Pavia, chasing new opportunities, new contracts, anywhere the family's fortunes might stabilize. But there was a complication. Albert was 15 years old, in the middle of his gymnasium studies. The family decided he should remain behind in Munich, lodging with relatives, to complete his degree. He was, in effect, left alone, 16 years old, in a city that had never fully accepted him, attending a school that had explicitly told him he would amount to nothing, with his entire family now living in a different country. Try for a moment to feel the weight of that, not as a historical footnote, but as the lived experience of an adolescent boy, abandoned by necessity rather than malice, in a place that had only ever made him feel like an outsider, with no one nearby who truly understood how his mind worked. He lasted approximately 6 months alone in Munich. Then Albert made a decision that would become the first in a recurring pattern throughout his life. When an institution or a nation demanded his submission and offered him nothing in return, he left. He walked into the gymnasium's administrative office and announced his departure, using a doctor's note citing nervous exhaustion as his justification. It was not entirely a fabrication. The years of suppressed frustration had taken a genuine toll, but it was also undeniably an exit strategy, executed with the same precision he would later apply to far more consequential decisions. At the same time, Albert took an additional, more radical step. He formally renounced his German citizenship. He refused to remain legally and militarily bound to a nation whose rigid authoritarian culture he had come to despise, a country that, under the laws of the time, would soon have required him to perform compulsory military service. This was the first time Albert Einstein renounced a national identity in protest of what that nation represented. It would not be the last. He crossed the Alps, alone, by train, and appeared, entirely unannounced, at his family's new home in Pavia. Hermann was furious. The boy had no diploma, no plan, no concrete path forward, only a vague, stubborn insistence that he could study independently and apply directly to a university without finishing secondary school in the conventional way, the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich. There was just one significant problem standing between Albert and his ambition. The Polytechnic required a rigorous entrance examination, covering subjects far beyond physics and mathematics, subjects Albert had never properly studied, taught by teachers he had abandoned in another country. He was about to attempt something almost reckless, walking into one of Europe's most demanding entrance exams, 2 years younger than the typical applicant, with no formal preparation at all. In October 1895, 16-year-old Albert Einstein sat the entrance examination for the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich. The results were, in their own way, a perfect mirror of everything we already know about him. In mathematics and physics, he performed brilliantly, exceptional scores that immediately marked him as something unusual. In botany, zoology, modern languages, and general literature, he failed outright. He was rejected. It was a genuine humiliation, particularly coming so soon after his dramatic, defiant departure from Munich. He had crossed the Alps with nothing but conviction. The conviction, it turned out, was not enough on its own. But something remarkable happened in the aftermath of that rejection, something that would, in hindsight, prove to be one of the most important interventions in the entire history of physics. The director of the Polytechnic, Heinrich Weber, took the unusual step of personally reviewing Albert's exam and adding a note of his own. The young man, Weber wrote in effect, clearly possessed real talent, but he was simply not yet ready, not broadly enough educated to succeed in the program. Weber suggested an alternative: spend a year at the cantonal school in the Swiss town of Aarau, filling in the gaps, and then reapply. It was in every sense a second chance, and Albert took it. Aarau changed everything. The school itself was, in its philosophy, almost the precise inverse of the Munich gymnasium, relaxed rather than rigid, genuinely curious rather than merely disciplinary, interested in whether students actually understood a concept rather than whether they could recite it on command. But the more significant transformation happened outside the classroom. Albert was placed in the home of one of his teachers, Jost Winteler, and the warm, intellectually alive household of the Winteler family gave Albert, for what may have been the first time in his life, a genuine experience of what learning could feel like when it was driven by real curiosity rather than institutional demand. It was Winteler who encouraged something unusual in young Albert. Not simply calculation, but visualization. Imagine the physics. Don't just solve the equation. Picture what is actually happening. And it was during this period at Aarau that Winteler, or perhaps Albert himself, in conversation with him, posed a question that would lodge itself in Albert's mind for the next decade, refusing to be resolved, refusing to let go. What would you see if you could ride alongside a beam of light? This single question, deceptively simple, almost like a riddle a child might ask, would not be properly answered for 10 more years. And when it finally was answered, in 1905, it would dismantle 200 years of accepted physics and permanently change how humanity understands the universe. It began here, in Aarau, in a conversation we have only fragments of, between a teenage boy and a teacher who encouraged him to imagine rather than merely calculate. Albert graduated from Aarau and reapplied to the Zurich Polytechnic. This time, with his gaps filled in, he was accepted. In October 1896, at 17 years old, Albert Einstein formally enrolled in a program specifically designed to train mathematics and physics teachers. He was, for the first time in his life, free to immerse himself entirely in the subjects he actually loved. But freedom, for Albert, did not mean conformity, not even here. Not even in an institution he respected far more than the gymnasium he'd fled. The Polytechnic experience was better, certainly, but it was still a formal academic structure, with lectures, attendance expectations, and professors who expected a certain deference. Albert simply stopped attending the lectures he found uninspiring, which, by most accounts, was the majority of them. Instead, he spent enormous amounts of time in the library, reading original papers, not textbook summaries, not second-hand simplifications, but the actual published work of physicists like James Clerk Maxwell, Hermann von Helmholtz, and Ludwig Boltzmann, the men who had made the discoveries themselves. There was a real logic to this approach, and it is worth understanding why. Albert wanted to engage with physics at the absolute frontier, to see exactly how these great minds had reasoned their way to a discovery, not simply receive a polished, simplified conclusion handed down by a professor who was, in most cases, several steps removed from the cutting edge himself. But this approach came with a serious cost. The professors noticed his absences. They noticed his evident belief that he could learn more from the original sources than from their lectures. And being human, with egos like anyone else's, several of them resented it deeply. This resentment would not stay confined to the classroom. It would follow Albert for years, in the form of professional doors that quietly, deliberately, refused to open. It was also at the Polytechnic that Albert met Miliva Maric. She was the only woman in the physics program, a Serbian student who had fought against considerable resistance for the right to study physics at all in an era when the field was almost entirely closed to women. She was brilliant, serious, intense, in a way that matched something in Albert's own temperament. The two of them began spending increasing amounts of time together, first as intellectual companions, debating physics problems, and then, gradually, as something more. Albert's early letters to Miliva are a striking mixture, equations interwoven with declarations of affection, physics and love arriving on the same page, in the same sentence sometimes. She understood his mind in a way that almost no one else in his life ever had, and in those early years he valued that understanding intensely. There is a genuinely contested historical question here, and an honest account of Einstein's life cannot simply skip past it. Some of Albert's early letters to Miliva reference our work and our theory, language suggesting a true intellectual partnership, a shared act of discovery. Yet when his papers were eventually published, only one name appeared on them, his. Historians continue to debate, without full resolution, exactly how much intellectual contribution Miliva made to Albert's early thinking. We do not know the full truth. What we do know is that the question itself, of credit given and credit withheld, would not be the last time it shadowed Albert Einstein's personal relationships. In 1900, Albert graduated from the Polytechnic. The ranking was unambiguous and, in its own way, brutal. 4th out of 5 students in his program. His former classmates, the very people he had often outpaced intellectually, received academic positions almost immediately upon graduation. Albert received nothing. He wrote letters, dozens of them, to professors and institutions across Europe, requesting any position, any opportunity, any foothold in academic physics. The responses, when they came at all, were polite rejections. He even approached his own professors at the Polytechnic, the men who had taught him, asking for recommendation letters. They declined. Years of resentment over his absent attendance, his evident belief that he knew better, his intellectual arrogance, whether justified or not, had left him without allies in exactly the community he needed. Albert had believed, with the simple confidence of a young man who has only ever been judged on raw ability, that talent alone would be sufficient to build a career. He discovered, in the most painful way possible, that academic careers in his era depended heavily on relationships, on professional conformity, on being liked by the people who controlled the gates, and these were precisely the qualities he had spent 4 years demonstrating he had no interest in cultivating. What followed were 2 genuinely difficult years, tutoring jobs that paid little and offered no stability, temporary teaching positions that ended without warning, mounting financial precarity, and a deepening despair that he expressed candidly in his private correspondence. To a friend, he wrote, with unguarded bitterness, "I am nothing but a burden to my parents, a failure," a description he gave, with brutal self-honesty, of how he saw himself during this period. And it was during this same period of professional collapse that something else happened. Something Albert would carry as a private wound for the rest of his life, something he would never speak of publicly, something the world would not learn about until decades after his death. In the spring of 1901, Miliva discovered she was pregnant. She returned to her family in Serbia to await the birth, away from the judgmental eyes of Swiss society, which had no tolerance for a child born outside of marriage. In January 1902, she gave birth to a daughter. In their correspondence, they called her Liesel. Almost nothing is known about this child. She appears in a small handful of surviving letters between Albert and Miliva, fragments, brief mentions, a name, and then she vanishes entirely from the historical record. The most widely accepted theory among historians is that she died of scarlet fever in 1903, still an infant. Some historians have suggested instead that she may have been given up for adoption. We simply do not know which is true. What we do know is this: Albert never saw his daughter, not once. He never spoke of her in any public account of his life. She was entirely erased from his official biography, so thoroughly erased that the letters revealing her existence at all were not discovered by historians until the 1980s, decades after Albert's death. It would be a serious mistake to treat this as a minor historical footnote, an interesting curiosity for trivia. This is something far more significant. The first documented evidence of a pattern that would recur in different forms throughout Albert Einstein's personal life. A man whose entire intellectual project was built on confronting hard, uncomfortable truths about the physical universe, who refused to accept a comfortable, easy explanation when a harder, truer one was available, could not, when it came to his own life, face the consequences of his own choices. He could question the nature of time itself. He could not face his own daughter. By the middle of 1902, Albert Einstein's professional life was, by any reasonable measure, in ruins. A graduate with no position, no prospects, and a string of rejections behind him. His personal life held a secret he would carry, unspoken, to his grave. And then, almost as an afterthought, almost as a consolation prize for a career that seemed to have already failed before it began, a friend's father mentioned a vacancy, a modest position at the Swiss Federal Office for Intellectual Property, examining patent applications. It would turn out to be the single most important job offer in the history of physics. In June 1902, Albert Einstein began work at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern, hired as a technical expert, third class, at an annual salary of 3,500 Swiss francs. It was, on its face, an unglamorous appointment, a stable government job for an unemployed physics graduate who had run out of other options. A small office, stacks of patent applications on the desk. A young man, 23 years old, plain suit, restless energy barely contained, reads through a description of some new mechanical or electrical device. His job: determine whether the invention being described is scientifically sound and genuinely original, and then write a clear, careful report recommending approval or rejection. Here is what almost no one noticed at the time, including quite possibly Albert himself, at least not at first. This unglamorous government job was in fact secretly perfectly suited to exactly the kind of mind he had. Think about what the job actually demanded. Read a claim, question its assumptions, identify any logical inconsistency, refuse to accept an explanation that did not hold up under careful scrutiny. These were precisely the skills that had made Albert Einstein such a difficult, frustrating student throughout his entire education. In the patent office, that same restless skepticism was not a problem to be disciplined out of him. It was the job description. His supervisor, Friedrich Haller, recognized the young examiner's unusual aptitude and began entrusting him with increasingly complex cases. Devices involving electromagnetism, timing mechanisms, signal synchronization across distances. Albert moved through these evaluations with remarkable speed because, unlike many of his colleagues, he understood the underlying physical principles deeply enough to see through to the heart of a problem almost immediately. And this speed gave him something invaluable: time. By most accounts, Albert could complete a genuinely thorough day's worth of patent examinations in roughly 3 to 4 hours. The remaining hours of his workday, so long as he appeared appropriately occupied at his desk, went largely unsupervised. Albert used this stolen time for his own private research, scribbling calculations and theoretical sketches on sheets of paper that he could quickly slide into a desk drawer if a supervisor happened to walk past. The patent office, this small, quiet, unglamorous government building in Bern, became something like a monastery for him, a place of stability, of routine, of just enough solitude to think, really think, at the deepest level his mind was capable of, undisturbed by the politics, the favor trading, and the institutional resentments that had poisoned his academic prospects. His personal life, meanwhile, was settling into its own quiet rhythm. In January 1903, Albert and Mileva married, a modest, practical ceremony without fanfare. In May 1904, their son Hans Albert was born. It was also during this period that Albert formed what would become known, half-jokingly, as the Olympia Academy, a small, informal discussion group with 2 close friends, meeting in cafes and modest apartments around Bern. They drank coffee, argued late into the evening, and worked their way through the philosophy of David Hume, the scientific critiques of Ernst Mach, who had challenged the foundational assumptions of Newtonian mechanics, and whatever puzzles happened to be sitting at the frontier of physics at that moment. The name was a joke. The substance behind it was entirely genuine, perhaps the first true intellectual community Albert had ever experienced, a space where ideas could be tested, challenged and refined among equals, with none of the institutional hierarchy that had so often suffocated him. And within that small, unglamorous circle, one obsession kept resurfacing, refusing to be resolved: the nature of light itself. James Clerk Maxwell's equations had demonstrated, decades earlier, that light is fundamentally an electromagnetic wave. But every wave known to physics required a medium to travel through. Sound needs air, ocean waves need water. Physicists of the era had proposed that light, too, required a medium, an invisible, undetectable substance they called the luminiferous ether, theorized to fill the entirety of empty space. There was only one problem. Every experiment ever designed to actually detect this ether had failed completely. The most famous of these attempts, the Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887, had searched specifically for evidence of the Earth's motion through this supposed ether, and found absolutely nothing. The ether, despite its theoretical necessity, simply did not seem to exist. So a deeply uncomfortable question hung over the whole field of physics. If light is a wave, but there is no medium for it to wave in, what exactly is actually happening? And buried within that question was the old riddle from Arau, the one that had refused to let Albert go for nearly a decade. What would you actually see if you could somehow travel alongside a beam of light matching its speed exactly? Would the light appear to freeze in place like a wave caught motionless? That seemed to make no physical sense at all. And yet no one, not Maxwell, not anyone, had a satisfying answer. In the first months of 1905, a 26-year-old government patent clerk, a man with no academic position, no institutional affiliation, no professional reputation whatsoever in the world of physics, sat down and began writing. Over the course of that single year, he would complete 4 separate scientific papers. Each one, on its own, would have been a career-defining achievement for any physicist alive. Together, they would make the entire 19th century's understanding of physical reality obsolete. Physics would never be the same again. Historians now refer to 1905 as Einstein's annus mirabilis, his miracle year. It is, by broad consensus among physicists and historians alike, one of the single most extraordinary intellectual outpourings in the entire history of science. Let us walk through each paper in turn, because each one deserves to be understood, not merely named. Paper 1, The Photoelectric Effect, March 1905. Here was the puzzle that had quietly confounded physicists for years. Shine ultraviolet light on a metal surface, and it knocks electrons loose, ejecting them from the metal entirely. This much was observed fact. But shine ordinary red light on that same metal surface, even an intensely bright beam of red light, far more powerful in raw energy than the ultraviolet, and nothing happens. No electrons are released. Not one. Classical wave theory had no answer for this. Under the accepted understanding of light as a continuous wave, intensity should be what matters. Pour enough energy onto the metal, in any color, and eventually electrons should be knocked loose. But that simply was not what experiments showed. Albert's solution was, for its time, almost unthinkably radical. He proposed that light itself does not travel as a smooth, continuous wave at all. At least, not only that. Light comes in discrete packets of energy, which he called quanta. Each individual quantum carries an amount of energy directly proportional to its frequency. Ultraviolet light, with its high frequency, delivers quanta energetic enough to knock an electron loose on contact. Red light, with its much lower frequency, delivers quanta too weak to do the job. And no amount of additional quanta, no matter how many, no matter how bright the beam, can compensate for that fundamental weakness, because each individual packet simply does not carry enough energy. This is the very paper for which Albert Einstein eventually received the Nobel Prize in Physics. Not, as most people assume, for relativity, and in 1905 it was almost entirely ignored by the wider scientific community. Its true significance went far beyond solving one isolated puzzle about metals and electrons. This paper cracked open the door to an entirely new branch of physics, quantum mechanics, a revolution Einstein himself helped to begin, but which would later travel to places he could never bring himself to follow. Paper 2, Brownian Motion, May 1905. The second paper tackled an entirely different mystery. Why do microscopic particles, suspended in a liquid and viewed under a microscope, jitter and dance in seemingly random, ceaseless motion. Albert demonstrated, through rigorous mathematics, that this strange dance was caused by countless invisible collisions, the particles being struck from all directions by individual molecules of the liquid itself, too small to see directly, but detectable through their cumulative effect. This may sound on its surface like a relatively modest technical result. It was not. This paper provided the first truly definitive proof that atoms and molecules actually exist as physical, countable entities, settling a genuine scientific debate that had divided physicists for decades. Some respected scientists of the era still considered atoms a useful mathematical convenience rather than physical reality. Einstein's calculations, later confirmed experimentally, ended that debate for good. Atoms are real. A patent examiner in Bern proved it. Paper 3, Special Relativity, June 1905. This is the centerpiece. This is the paper that changed everything. The setup, again, was the unresolved puzzle of light and the missing ether. Maxwell's equations predicted that light travels at one fixed speed. But relative to what exactly, if there is no medium for it to move through? The Michelson-Morley experiment had searched for the ether and found nothing. Albert's resolution was breathtaking in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. There is no ether, he proposed. There never was. Light does not need a medium at all. It simply travels at a single, fixed speed, and that speed is exactly the same for every observer in the universe, regardless of how fast or in what direction that observer happens to be moving. Sit with that claim for a moment, because it sounds almost too simple to be revolutionary, and that simplicity is exactly what makes it so devastating. If that single statement is true, and every experiment ever conducted has confirmed that it is, then something else, something fundamental has to give. And what gives is everything humanity had assumed for 2 centuries about the nature of time and space themselves. If the speed of light truly is constant for every observer, no matter their own motion, then time itself cannot be the same for everyone. The faster an object moves, the slower time passes for that object, relative to someone standing still, not as an illusion, not as some trick of perception, but as a literal, physical feature of reality itself. Space itself contracts, very slightly, along the direction of motion. There is no single, universal now that everyone in the universe shares. 2 events that appear perfectly simultaneous to one observer may not be simultaneous at all to another observer, moving at a different speed. Absolute time, absolute space. The 2 unshakable foundations beneath 200 years of Newtonian physics, the bedrock that Isaac Newton himself had built an entire scientific worldview upon. They were simply wrong. Perhaps the single most extraordinary feature of this paper, noted by historians of science again and again, is that it contains no citations whatsoever. Einstein was not building incrementally on someone else's published work, refining an existing theory step by careful step, the way science usually proceeds. He derived an entirely new structure of space and time from pure first principles, through sheer force of reasoning. This is almost unheard of in the history of physics. The 4th paper was barely 3 pages long, a short addendum to the relativity paper, almost an afterthought in terms of its length. It contained the equation E equals mc squared. E. What does it actually mean? Mass and energy, Einstein showed, are not 2 separate things. They are 2 different forms of the exact same underlying reality. Mass is, in a very real sense, concentrated, locked-up energy. Energy, conversely, is liberated mass. The conversion factor between the 2, the rate of exchange, so to speak, is the speed of light, squared. And because the speed of light is an enormous number, roughly 300 million meters per second, squaring it produces a figure almost beyond ordinary human intuition, which means that even a tiny, almost negligible amount of mass, if fully converted, contains a staggering, almost unimaginable quantity of energy. A single paperclip's worth of mass, fully converted according to this equation, would release energy roughly equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. Einstein arrived at this equation while attempting to explain a purely astronomical mystery. Why do stars shine continuously for billions of years without exhausting some conventional fuel source? The equation was, in his own mind at the time, purely theoretical. an elegant piece of mathematics describing the deep structure of the universe with no foreseeable practical application whatsoever. He did not imagine, in 1905, that anyone could ever actually access this energy, extract it, weaponize it. He was wrong. The practical implications of this short, 3-page paper would not become fully, horrifyingly visible for another 40 years in the sky above a city called Hiroshima. But that is a story for later. In 1905, this devastating implication was invisible, buried in pure mathematics, understood by almost no one at all. And that, remarkably, is exactly what happened to the entire miracle year. The papers were submitted to respected physics journals and accepted. The mathematics was simply too rigorous, too internally consistent for any editor to dismiss outright. But almost no one in the wider scientific community took serious notice. Einstein was not a university professor. He held no academic position, belonged to no research institution, attended no conferences where ideas like these were debated among peers. He was a patent examiner in Bern, an outsider submitting papers from entirely outside the established channels of academic physics. There was one crucial exception. Max Planck, already among the most respected physicists in Europe, and the man whose own earlier work on energy quanta had helped lay the groundwork for Einstein's photoelectric paper, recognized immediately the significance of the relativity paper in particular. Planck's attention and his willingness to take this unknown patent clerk seriously slowly began to shift the tide of Einstein's reputation within the physics community. Special relativity had rewritten the fundamental nature of space and time itself, but Einstein, even as he celebrated this achievement quietly, privately, understood that he had left something enormous unaddressed. Gravity. His new theory explained objects moving at constant velocity beautifully. It said nothing at all about acceleration, or about the force that bends every falling apple, every orbiting planet, every star in the night sky. Solving that problem, finding a theory of gravity consistent with everything he had just discovered about space and time, would consume the next decade of his life and push him to the absolute edge of his own intellectual capacity. The years following the miracle year brought Einstein a slow, steady, almost vindicating rise through academia, the very world that had once refused him a single position. He became an unpaid lecturer in Bern in 1908, then an associate professor in Zurich in 1909, a full professor in Prague in 1911, back to Zurich, this time at the Polytechnic itself, in 1912, and then, in 1914, the most prestigious appointment available anywhere in German science, a position at the Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin, with no teaching obligations whatsoever, and complete freedom to pursue whatever research he chose. Consider the distance traveled. In barely more than a decade, a man who had been rejected by every professor he wrote to, denied even a recommendation letter from his own instructors, had risen to occupy the single most prestigious research position in German physics, the very pinnacle of European science. But fame and position were not for Einstein the point. The actual problem, gravity, remained stubbornly, maddeningly unsolved. Here was the difficulty. Special relativity functioned beautifully for objects moving in a straight line at a constant speed, but it had nothing at all to say about acceleration or about gravitational fields, and Newton's centuries-old law of gravity, which assumed that gravitational force acted instantaneously, transmitted across any distance with no delay whatsoever, was flatly incompatible with the speed of light limit that relativity had just imposed on the entire universe. Nothing, relativity insisted, can travel faster than light, but Newton's gravity acted instantly, everywhere, with no travel time at all. Something had to be wrong. Einstein began wrestling with this problem as early as 1907, and it would not release him for 8 more years. The breakthrough insight, when it eventually crystallized, was almost shockingly elegant, even though the mathematics required to express it properly would prove to be one of the hardest problems Einstein ever faced. Gravity, he came to believe, is not actually a force at all, not in the way Newton had described it. Gravity is the curvature of space-time itself. Picture a stretched rubber sheet with a heavy ball placed at its center, creating a deep depression. Roll a smaller marble nearby, and it does not travel in a straight line. It curves inward, spiraling toward the heavy ball, not because the heavy ball is reaching out and pulling it, but because the marble is simply following the curved shape of the sheet itself, the only path available to it. That, in essence, is general relativity. Massive objects, planets, stars, bend the very fabric of space and time around themselves. Other objects, moving through that bent fabric, follow the curves that result. An apple does not fall because the earth reaches out and pulls it downward, the way Newton had described it for 200 years. The apple falls because the earth's mass warps the space-time surrounding it, and the apple is simply moving in the straightest possible line through space that has itself been bent. It is a conception of reality both radically different from anything that came before it, and once understood, almost unbearably beautiful. But translating that elegant physical insight into rigorous mathematics very nearly broke him. Einstein needed mathematical tools he simply did not yet possess. Non-Euclidean geometry, tensor calculus, branches of mathematics far outside what a physicist of his era would typically need. He turned to his old friend from the Polytechnic, the mathematician Marcel Grossmann, and the two worked together for years, with Einstein essentially teaching himself an entirely new mathematical language while simultaneously trying to build an entirely new physical theory on top of it. The toll on his health was significant. Stomach ailments, severe migraines, exhaustion that left him drained for days. His notebooks from this period are filled with calculations, abandoned approaches, errors discovered and corrected, entire lines of reasoning pursued for months only to be set aside. In 1913, Einstein believed, for a time, that he had finally solved it. He published preliminary field equations together with Grossmann and began promoting them publicly as the long-sought solution. Other physicists, examining the work carefully, identified serious problems. The equations, it turned out, violated principles that Einstein himself had previously established as essential. He defended his work initially, and then, with the same intellectual honesty that had driven his entire career, slowly came to accept that his critics were correct. He had made genuine errors. He started over. 2 more years of grinding, uncertain work lay ahead of him. And as if the scientific struggle alone were not enough, Einstein's personal life was simultaneously collapsing. His marriage to Mileva, once a partnership of genuine intellectual equals, 2 physics students who had fallen in love over shared problem sets, had deteriorated almost completely. Mileva had been Albert's intellectual companion at the Polytechnic, a woman who had fought for her own place in a field that excluded women almost entirely. Now she found herself a wife and mother, watching her husband ascend to exactly the kind of career she herself had once dreamed of while she remained at home. The resentment, understandably, calcified over years into something closer to bitterness. Their second son, Eduard, was born in 1910. Albert, increasingly consumed by his work, was absent, not just physically, on his frequent travels and long hours at the university, but emotionally as well. When the family relocated to Berlin in April 1914, following Albert's prestigious new appointment, Mileva found she despised nearly everything about the move. The city, the social expectations, the marginalization she felt within Albert's increasingly public, increasingly self-absorbed academic life. Within weeks of arriving in Berlin, Albert presented Mileva with a written document, a list of conditions, typed out with the same cold precision he might apply to a patent application, under which he would be willing to continue the marriage at all. The terms were stark, almost clinical, utterly without warmth. She would keep his clothes and personal effects in order. She would ensure he received his 3 meals daily, delivered to his room. She would expect no intimacy from him whatsoever, and would not reproach him for that. She would stop speaking to him immediately, without protest, whenever he requested silence. She would leave his bedroom or study at once if asked, without argument. This was not a marriage being negotiated. This was a man hiring a housekeeper and asking his wife to accept the position. Mileva took their 2 sons and returned to Zurich in July 1914. Albert, by his own account, in letters to friends from this period, felt something close to relief. He had, in the most painful and cold-blooded way imaginable, traded his family for the uninterrupted solitude his work demanded. Days later, the First World War erupted across Europe. Within weeks, the overwhelming majority of Albert's intellectual colleagues in Germany, 93 prominent scientists, scholars, and cultural figures, including the great physicist Max Planck himself, a man Einstein deeply respected, signed a public manifesto enthusiastically endorsing Germany's war effort and its military conduct. Albert refused to add his name. Instead, he became one of only 4 signatories on a far smaller, far more isolated counter-manifesto, calling instead for peace and for European intellectual cooperation, rejecting the nationalist fervor sweeping the continent. This decision isolated him profoundly within his own professional community. Colleagues who had come to respect his physics now began openly questioning his patriotism, his loyalty, his judgment. But Einstein had already, once before in his life, fled the suffocating grip of German nationalism, renouncing his citizenship as a teenager rather than submit to its demands. He was not about to pretend, now, as an adult, that this same nationalism had somehow become noble simply because it was dressed in the uniform of wartime necessity. And then, in November 1915, after 2 more years of relentless, exhausting refinement, the breakthrough finally arrived. Einstein stood before the Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin and presented the final completed form of his gravitational field equations, the mathematics of general relativity, at last fully realized. The core principle could be stated with startling simplicity in a single elegant pairing. Mass tells spacetime how to curve. Curved spacetime tells mass how to move. He immediately applied his new equations to a long-standing astronomical puzzle, a slight, peculiar irregularity in the orbit of the planet Mercury, a tiny precession in its path around the Sun that Newtonian gravity had never been able to fully explain, no matter how the calculations were adjusted. Einstein's new field equations predicted that exact irregularity, with precision, with no adjustment, no fudging. He later described the emotional impact of this confirmation in deeply personal terms, recounting that his heart palpitated as though something inside him had physically snapped into place. His theory generated 3 distinct, testable predictions. The Mercury precession was the first, and it was already confirmed. The second, a subtle reddening of light escaping a strong gravitational field, was theoretically sound, but with the technology of the era, extraordinarily difficult to measure directly. The third was the most dramatic and the most visually demonstrable, the bending of light itself around a massive object. Starlight passing close to the edge of the Sun on its way to Earth should be deflected very slightly by the Sun's gravity, a deflection invisible under normal conditions, since the Sun's overwhelming brightness would always drown out the dim light of nearby stars. But during a total solar eclipse, when the Moon blocks the Sun's light entirely, those same stars become visible, close to the Sun's darkened edge, and any deflection in their apparent position could, in principle, be measured and compared against Einstein's precise prediction. 1.75 arcseconds. There was only one obstacle. Europe was at war. No scientific expedition, British or otherwise, could realistically be organized to travel anywhere and observe an eclipse in the middle of the most destructive conflict the continent had ever experienced. The theory was complete. It had been published, and it was, by any mathematical standard, breathtakingly beautiful. All it needed now was proof. Visible, undeniable, public proof. And that proof required an eclipse, observed under the most difficult conditions imaginable in a world still consumed by war. Einstein would have to wait. And in waiting, history was about to transform him into something he had never once sought to become. The First World War ended in November 1918. Germany's defeat brought the collapse of the old imperial government. The Kaiser abdicated, revolution spread through the streets of Berlin, and a fragile new democratic government, the Weimar Republic, was assembled out of the wreckage. Among the British scientists who had followed Einstein's theoretical work closely throughout the war years was Arthur Eddington, a distinguished astronomer, a devout Quaker, and a committed pacifist in his own right. Eddington understood, perhaps better than almost anyone else in Britain, that the solar eclipse scheduled for May 29, 1919, represented a singular, perhaps irreplaceable opportunity to finally test Einstein's prediction about the bending of starlight. Consider the political delicacy of what Eddington was attempting. He needed to convince the Royal Astronomical Society and the Royal Society of London, Britain's most venerable scientific institutions, to fund an expensive, logistically difficult expedition for the sole purpose of testing a theory proposed by a German physicist, using British resources mere months after Britain and Germany had finished trying to destroy one another in the bloodiest war in human history. He succeeded. 2 separate expeditions were organized, one to the small island of Príncipe off the western coast of Africa, and a second to Sobral in northeastern Brazil. The technical difficulty of the actual measurement cannot be overstated. The predicted deflection of starlight was less than 2 arc seconds, an angle so minuscule it has been compared to measuring the width of a human hair viewed from 100 meters away. Atmospheric distortion threatened to ruin the readings. Equipment could fail. And worst of all, simple weather, clouds drifting across the sun at precisely the wrong moment, could destroy the entire opportunity in an instant, with no second chance for years. Príncipe Island, May 29, 1919. Eddington and his small team stand beside their telescopic equipment, watching storm clouds drift ominously across the sky as the moment of total eclipse approaches. The sky darkens. For a handful of crucial minutes, the clouds part, just enough, just barely enough, to allow brief, precious moments of clear observation before closing again. The photographic plates were developed, the measurements painstakingly calculated and recalculated, and the results, when finally confirmed, matched Einstein's prediction. On November 6, 1919, the Royal Society and the Royal Astronomical Society convened a joint meeting in London, held, with a sense of history almost too perfect to be coincidental, in the very same hall where a portrait of Isaac Newton hung on the wall to formally announce the results to the world. The observed deflection of starlight matched Einstein's calculation. Newton's 200-year-old theory of gravity, at least in this specific critical respect, had been definitively ruled out by direct observation. J.J. Thomson, the physicist who had discovered the electron decades earlier, chaired the historic meeting and famously declared the announcement one of the most momentous proclamations of human thought ever delivered before that society. The next morning, the world's press exploded with the news. The Times of London ran the headline, "Revolution in Science, Newtonian Ideas Overthrown." The New York Times, in its own characteristically dramatic style, announced, "Lights all askew in the heavens. Einstein theory triumphs." Albert Einstein woke up famous, not simply respected within a narrow academic circle, which he had only recently achieved after years of struggle, but genuinely, globally famous, overnight, the most celebrated scientist alive anywhere on Earth. And the nature of that celebrity was, in its own way, remarkable. Einstein possessed precisely the visual and personal qualities the public unconsciously expected from a genius: the wild, uncombed hair, the refusal to wear socks, which he found pointlessly impractical, the rumpled, oversized clothing, the ever-present pipe trailing smoke behind him on his daily walks. He looked, almost theatrically, exactly the way the public imagined genius ought to look. His humor, too, made him approachable in a way most revolutionary scientists never managed to be. Asked, repeatedly, to explain relativity in terms an ordinary person could grasp, he reportedly offered a simple analogy. The difference between an hour spent with a charming companion, which feels like a minute, and a minute spent sitting on a hot stove, which feels like an hour. Professional physicists, hearing this kind of simplification, often winced at how much nuance it sacrificed. The public adored it. In 1921, Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics, specifically and explicitly for his work on the photoelectric effect, not for relativity, which remained, even at this point, officially regarded by parts of the scientific establishment as too unproven or too controversial for Nobel recognition. The prize money, in its entirety, went to Mileva, fulfilling a promise Albert had made to her years earlier as part of their divorce settlement, made in a moment of confidence that he would eventually win the prize. That same year, 1921, Albert married for the second time to Elsa Lowenthal, his cousin, related to him on both sides of his extended family. The two had played together as children decades earlier, though their romantic relationship had not developed until much later in both their lives. Elsa offered Albert something Mileva, in the wreckage of their final years together, simply could not: a cheerful, uncomplicated, undemanding domestic stability. Their new combined household included Elsa's 2 daughters from her own previous marriage. Albert, by most accounts, was a warmer presence in this second marriage than he had been in his first, though he remained, fundamentally, emotionally distant, far more at ease in the company of equations than in the company of people, including, in many respects, the people closest to him. As Einstein's face spread across newspapers worldwide, as adoring crowds mobbed him on visits to New York, to Tokyo, to London, a darker and far more dangerous movement was simultaneously gathering strength back home in Germany, and it was about to seize upon his name, his Jewish identity, and his physics, and turn all three into a target. The Germany that emerged from the First World War was a wounded, humiliated nation, and that wound festered into something genuinely dangerous. Hyperinflation destroyed personal savings overnight. Unemployment soared. A poisonous political myth took hold, the claim that Germany had not truly been defeated on the battlefield at all, but had instead been betrayed from within, stabbed in the back by internal enemies, and the punishing terms of the Versailles Treaty added a raw, ongoing humiliation that right-wing nationalist movements were eager to exploit. Old hatreds found new, organized political form, and one of their earliest scientific targets was relativity itself. A vocal movement of right-wing nationalist physicists and propagandists began openly declaring that relativity theory was fraudulent, dismissing it as a symptom of what they called Jewish science, a supposed cultural tendency among Jewish thinkers to obscure simple truths behind needless, abstract complexity, in contrast to what they characterized as straightforward, intuitive German physics. This was never, in any honest sense, a genuine scientific debate. It was organized hatred, wearing the borrowed authority and vocabulary of science as a weapon. Philip Leonard, himself a Nobel laureate in physics, lent his own considerable scientific credibility to this campaign, a deeply troubling example of how easily even genuine scientific achievement can be weaponized in service of prejudice. In August 1920, a public rally specifically organized to denounce relativity theory was held at one of Berlin's largest concert halls. The hall was packed. Speaker after speaker took the stage to denounce Einstein personally, as a plagiarist, as a charlatan, as a fraud who had stolen credit for ideas that were not truly his own. Einstein himself attended, sitting quietly in the audience, listening to the denunciations directed at him by name. He later claimed, in public remarks, to find the entire spectacle rather amusing. Privately, by the account of those closest to him, it shook him considerably, more than he was willing to admit publicly. The threat was not confined to rhetoric. In June 1922, Walter Rathenau, Germany's foreign minister, a prominent Jewish intellectual and a personal friend of Einstein's, was assassinated by right-wing extremists. The murder made unmistakably clear that the hostility directed at prominent German Jews, including Einstein himself, was not merely an unpleasant background noise of public debate. It was a genuine lethal threat. Through the 1920s, even as this danger simmered at home, Einstein's international fame only continued to grow. He lectured across the globe, France, Britain, the United States, Japan, Argentina, throughout South America, drawing enormous enthusiastic crowds wherever he appeared. Even before Einstein had formally taken up permanent residence in the United States, the American FBI had already begun compiling a file on him, a file that would, over the following decades, grow to a genuinely staggering size. Einstein visited Palestine during this period, while it remained under British administrative mandate, witnessing firsthand the early Zionist movement's efforts to build toward an eventual Jewish homeland. In 1925, he agreed to join the Board of Governors of the newly established Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a cause he would continue to support for the rest of his life. It was also throughout the mid to late 1920s that Einstein found himself engaged in one of the most consequential intellectual disputes of the entire century, the Bohr-Einstein debates. A younger generation of physicists, Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, Niels Bohr, Wolfgang Pauli, Max Born, were rapidly developing an entirely new framework, quantum mechanics. And what they were discovering was deeply unsettling, even to many physicists who had themselves helped build the framework. Electrons, it appeared, did not occupy a single definite position at any given moment, but existed instead as a kind of probability cloud, a smeared range of possible locations. Werner Heisenberg's famous uncertainty principle demonstrated that measuring one property of a subatomic particle precisely necessarily disturbed and blurred another property. At its deepest level, the quantum world appeared to be fundamentally, irreducibly probabilistic, governed by chance, not by strict deterministic cause and effect. This was, for Einstein, almost unbearable. His entire scientific worldview, the conviction planted at age 5, holding that compass, that something deeply hidden, but ultimately knowable, lay behind every phenomenon in the universe, rebelled against the idea that the universe's most fundamental level might simply be governed by chance, with no underlying deterministic mechanism waiting to be discovered. He summarized his objection in a phrase that has since become one of the most quoted lines in the history of science: "God does not play dice with the universe." Niels Bohr's reported response was equally sharp: "Stop telling God what to do." These debates played out most famously at the 1927 Solvay Conference in Brussels, a gathering so densely populated with extraordinary minds that 17 of the 29 attendees had either already won or would eventually go on to win a Nobel Prize. By several accounts, Einstein would arrive each morning with a new thought experiment specifically designed to expose some hidden logical inconsistency within quantum mechanics. And Bohr, working through the problem over the course of the day, would typically return by evening with a careful rebuttal. On at least one notable occasion, using Einstein's own relativity theory to dismantle Einstein's own objection. Einstein was never fully convinced. He came to accept eventually that quantum mechanics worked, that its predictions were experimentally verified again and again. But he remained convinced for the rest of his life that the theory was somehow incomplete, that beneath its apparent randomness, some deeper, deterministic set of laws remained undiscovered. Most of his physicist colleagues disagreed. The greatest physicist of his generation found himself increasingly isolated within the very field he had helped to revolutionize. There was one further significant retreat during this period. Einstein had, years earlier, introduced a mathematical term into his general relativity equations, the cosmological constant, specifically to support a model of a static, unchanging universe, which matched the prevailing assumption of the time. When the astronomer Edwin Hubble demonstrated in 1929 definitive observational evidence that the universe was not static at all, but actually expanding outward, Einstein was forced to abandon the constant entirely. He later referred to its introduction as the greatest blunder of his entire scientific career. And then, on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within mere weeks, the new Nazi regime began the systematic dismantling of German democracy, alongside an organized purge of Jewish academics from German universities and institutions. Einstein, fortunately, was in the United States at the time, holding a visiting professorship at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. Friends and colleagues sent him urgent warnings. Do not come home. His apartment in Berlin was raided by Nazi paramilitary stormtroopers. His personal bank accounts were frozen. German newspapers, which had once celebrated him as a national treasure, now denounced him publicly as a traitor. From California, Einstein sent a formal letter of resignation to the Prussian Academy of Sciences, the very institution that had once represented the absolute pinnacle of his career. And he renounced his German citizenship for the second time in his life. For the second time, Albert Einstein fled the country of his birth. This time, he understood with complete certainty that he would never return. In October 1933, he sailed for the United States permanently. What he could not yet know, what no one on either side of the Atlantic could yet fully grasp, was that the very equation he had quietly derived in a Berne patent office 28 years earlier was, at that exact moment, beginning to attract the close attention of military planners on two separate continents. Einstein settled in Princeton, New Jersey, where the newly established Institute for Advanced Study offered him precisely the conditions that had once made the Berne Patent Office so secretly productive. No teaching obligations, complete freedom of research, a generous salary, and a quiet, unhurried intellectual environment. He moved into a modest house on Mercer Street and settled into a routine that would define the remainder of his life: a walk each morning to the Institute, in the same well-worn leather jacket, sockless, hair left entirely uncombed. Hours spent covering blackboards with dense equations, a walk back home in the evening, the next day, repeat. But exile carried its own quiet griefs. Elsa, his second wife, died of illness in December 1936. Their marriage, by most accounts, had been comfortable rather than passionate. She had provided the domestic order and stability that allowed him to disappear, undisturbed, into his work for decades. After her death, his secretary, Helen Dukas, and his stepdaughter, Margot, took over the management of the household. His relationship with his two biological sons remained complicated, in different and equally painful ways. Hans Albert eventually immigrated to the United States himself, building a respected career as an engineering professor. Father and son reconnected to a degree, but a real emotional distance lingered between them, old wounds from Albert's long absences and the bitter divorce that neither man ever fully addressed. Edouard, the younger son, remained in Switzerland with his mother Mileva, suffering from severe mental illness, schizophrenia, that eventually required his permanent institutionalization. He never saw his father again, not once, after Albert departed for America. It is a difficult, necessary truth. The man whose theories had reshaped humanity's understanding of the universe could not heal the wounds within his own family. One genuine friendship offered Einstein real companionship during these Princeton years. The mathematician and logician Kurt Gödel, himself a refugee from a collapsing Europe. The two men, both responsible for shaking the very foundations of their respective fields, Einstein in physics, Gödel in mathematical logic, would walk the streets of Princeton together for hours, conversing in German, discussing philosophy and the deepest unresolved questions in their respective disciplines. Two extraordinary minds, both profoundly isolated by the very qualities that made them extraordinary, finding in each other something close to genuine understanding. For roughly 30 years, spanning much of his later career, Einstein pursued what became known as the unified field theory, an ambitious, ultimately unsuccessful attempt to merge gravity and electromagnetism into a single, unified geometric framework. Every attempt produced mathematics that was, by all accounts, genuinely elegant, and not a single testable prediction that any experiment could verify. Younger physicists, increasingly absorbed in the rapid development of quantum mechanics, simply stopped paying serious attention to Einstein's later work. He had become, in the eyes of much of his own field, an aging genius chasing an impossible dream, while the actual future of physics unfolded without him. He understood exactly how his colleagues viewed this late career pursuit. He kept working anyway. It was, by this point in his life, the only thing that still gave his existence genuine meaning. And then, in January 1939, news arrived from Germany that would change the course of the entire century. Physicists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had successfully split a uranium atom. Nuclear fission was not merely theoretical anymore. It was real, demonstrated, achieved, and the energy released in the process matched, with remarkable precision, the prediction Einstein himself had made decades earlier in that brief 3-page paper, E=mc². If a controlled chain reaction of this fission process could be sustained and amplified, it could, in principle, produce a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. August 2, 1939. A car pulls up outside a modest summer cottage in Peconic, Long Island. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian physicist who had himself fled the rising tide of fascism in Europe, steps out, carrying a single folded letter. He has come to find Einstein, his old friend and occasional collaborator, summering quietly by the water. The conversation that follows, in the gathering heat of a Long Island summer afternoon, will alter the trajectory of human history. Szillard's message was direct and deeply alarming. Nazi Germany, he warned, was very likely developing its own atomic weapons program. Germany had recently halted all uranium exports from mines it controlled within occupied Czechoslovakia, a telling, ominous sign. German physicists, several of them among the very best in the world, understood nuclear physics as thoroughly as anyone on Earth. The United States, Szilard argued, urgently needed to begin its own research program, and to do that, it needed Roosevelt's direct attention, which required a signature recognizable enough and credible enough to actually reach the president's desk. Einstein faced, in that single afternoon, perhaps the most agonizing decision of his entire life. Every instinct he possessed as a committed lifelong pacifist screamed at him to refuse. And yet the alternative, a world in which Adolf Hitler alone possessed an atomic weapon, was simply unthinkable. He asked every question he could think to ask. How certain, really, was German progress towards such a weapon? Sillard's honest answer, very likely, though not absolutely certain. Could such a weapon actually physically be built, given the engineering challenges involved? Theoretically, yes, though formidable obstacles remained, with no guarantee of success. Might Germany ultimately fail in its own efforts, regardless of what America chose to do? Possibly. Might the United States spend years and enormous resources building a weapon, only to discover that Germany had never come close to the same achievement at all? Also, entirely possible. There were no good options before him. Every conceivable path seemed to lead towards some form of horror. But doing nothing, while Hitler's Germany potentially raced ahead, unchallenged toward an atomic weapon, seemed, in that moment, the single worst option of all. He signed the letter. The Einstein-Szilard letter, dated August 2nd, 1939, did not actually reach President Roosevelt's desk until October, delayed by the bureaucratic friction of getting any document into a busy president's hands. Roosevelt, upon reading it, authorized the formation of an advisory committee on uranium research. The Manhattan Project itself would not formally begin in earnest until 1942, but the chain of events that would eventually lead to Hiroshima had already begun, set in motion by a signature on a single sheet of paper on a quiet summer afternoon on Long Island. Einstein would later call the act of signing that letter the single greatest mistake of his entire life. But in August 1939, he could not yet know what history would eventually reveal. That Germany would never come close to actually building a working atomic bomb. That the weapon his signature helped set into motion would never be used against the regime he feared. That the war in Europe would end before the bomb was even ready for use. And that the weapon would be dropped anyway, on Japan. Einstein spent the war years in Princeton, deliberately kept at a careful distance from the Manhattan Project itself by American military leadership, who regarded his outspoken pacifism and his international political connections as a genuine security concern. He was aware, in only a general fragmentary way, of the project's progress, gleaned through occasional conversations with colleagues who were more directly involved. He played no direct technical role in the bomb's actual development. He knew that Enrico Fermi had achieved the world's first controlled nuclear chain reaction in Chicago in December 1942. He knew that massive industrial facilities were under construction at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and at Hanford, Washington. He knew that physicist Robert Oppenheimer was leading the theoretical research effort at a secret laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Throughout these years, Einstein continued his own increasingly solitary work on the unified field theory, equations that, by his own private acknowledgement, were leading nowhere, published largely out of lingering institutional respect for his earlier achievements, and read by very few of his colleagues. On August 6, 1945, Einstein was at his modest summer cottage on Saranac Lake in upstate New York when his secretary, Helen Dukas, heard the news over the radio. The United States had dropped a single atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Approximately 70,000 people had died in an instant. Tens of thousands more would die over the following days and weeks, from horrific burns and the unfamiliar, invisible agony of radiation sickness. When Dukas told him what had happened, Einstein's response was simple, immediate, and devastating in its brevity. "Oh my God!" He reportedly sat in silence for the remainder of that day. His equation, the one he had derived in 1905 in a quiet patent office in Bern, purely as an explanation for why distant stars continue to shine for billions of years, had just been demonstrated with horrifying finality on the bodies of an entire city. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. 40,000 more people died. On August 15th, Japan formally surrendered. The guilt that settled over Einstein in the aftermath never fully lifted. He told friends repeatedly in the years that followed that if he had known with certainty that Germany would ultimately fail to develop its own atomic weapon, he would never have signed Szillard's letter at all. He stated this directly, in his own words. "I made one great mistake in my life. when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made. The bomb had never, in the end, been used against the regime he had genuinely feared. It had been dropped on Japan, after Germany had already surrendered entirely. The official justifications offered afterward, that the bombing had ultimately saved lives by making a costly land invasion of Japan unnecessary, struck Einstein by most accounts as a form of rationalization rather than genuine moral justification. The weapon had been used, he came to believe, simply because it existed and had been built at enormous cost specifically to be used. And he had been the one who helped bring it into existence. He was 66 years old, the most famous scientist of the entire century, and the single most consequential, most dangerous action of his entire life had been the act of signing a letter at a borrowed desk on a quiet Long Island summer afternoon 6 years earlier. For the remaining decade of his life, Einstein would use every remaining ounce of his global platform and personal credibility to warn humanity against the very weapon his own signature had helped to unleash. The only open question left was whether anyone, anywhere, would actually choose to listen.